Hi. Here at Make Noise, we have an all-crew meeting every week. And usually each week, somebody from each zone will do a little deep dive on either what they've been up to at work or a historical or educational topic. Recently, we were treated to a fun presentation by Make Noise founder, Tony Rolando, who told us all about his history with tape music, sampling, and microsound, and how his personal story with these techniques would eventually lead to the development of the Phonogene and Morphagene. While I was listening, I was thinking to myself, it would be a shame if this story never got to leave the building. So a couple days later, we put Tony in front of the camera and asked him to do an extended version of it for the channel. I've been working with Tony for the better part of a decade, and I've also listened to or read just about every interview he's ever done. And I still learn some new things from this. So relax, grab a beverage or some popcorn, and enjoy.
So in the late 80s, the library in the town where I grew up, Springfield, Illinois, would have these yard sales where they would sell records and books that they were removing from the collection. And I purchased several records, but two of them are important to this story. Still have the old library stickers on them. So why are these important to the story? The reason is that these records talked about the instrumentation, and one of the instruments listed is tape, just simply tape. As you can see in the description, we have tape 1 and tape 2, and then performer. So this is at a time where I couldn't just go to the internet and look up what tape music was or what a tape musician was. So of course, I went back to the library and looked for music books, looked for books about tape music, but I couldn't find any. And it wasn't for another couple of years at a completely different library in Southern Illinois that I found this book, Composing with Tape Recorders. And of course I was thrilled, so I checked it out. And in this book, they describe all sorts of methods for composing with or playing tape music. But then I did not have a tape machine, so I needed to find a tape machine. And believe it or not, it was a little tough to do that in the 90s because the 90s, we didn't really have the eBay yet, and the resurgence of analog had not really happened yet. So people weren't valuing tape as a medium, or at least not where I lived. CD was king. We were all very excited to throw out our cassettes and turn them into CDs. CDs were easier, they sounded better, and that's what we wanted. So finding a tape machine was a bit of a task, but another year later or so, I just lucked out. I walked into thrift stores all the time. Anytime I drove by a Salvation Army or a Goodwill, I could not resist the urge to pull into the parking lot and walk in and check out the bric-a-brac section. The bric-a-brac section is where they put stuff that's not clothes and not housewares. So it's where you can find all the other random crap that they didn't have a spot for. So I walked into the bric-a-brac section and bam, there it was, the Superba. The Superba was a reel-to-reel recorder that seemed tailor-made for making tape music. And the reason is that it had built into it sound-on-sound recording. There was a splicing block attached to it, and it also had a built-in echo. It also had a variable speed, and it had input amplifier, so you could plug anything into it. You could plug a microphone, a guitar. It actually sounded great with guitar. You could distort the heck out of it. And so I took this thing home. It also came with a big box of tapes, most of which were it sounded like demo records for a country group, probably from that area. This was in Central Illinois, again, Springfield, at a Salvation Army. So I took this thing home, and I didn't have a copy of that book, Composing with Tape Recorders, because I had to return it to the library. But I could remember some of what they talked about in it, and so I started trying to do some tape loops or some of these techniques that they talked about in the book. And now you might be thinking, like, why? Why were you trying to do this? And like, by now, this is like 1994, 95. I think, honestly, it was just that hearing the music on these records, at the time, it was just this big mystery. So you've got to think of a person who has really only been exposed to classic rock radio, which was king in Central Illinois. So mostly Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, classic rock, Eagles, all the stuff that you think of when you think of classic rock. And then in addition to that, punk rock. Obviously, there was a vibrant punk rock underground. Even in my small conservative town of Springfield, Illinois, there was punk rock. So to hear this music just brought nothing but a big question mark. First of all, who is it for? How did they make it? How did they make music with tape? Tape to me was just a way of listening to music, and not the greatest way either. You got to remember, cassettes were not cool. We were running as fast as we could from cassettes. So this idea that you could use tape to make music, it didn't make any sense. So I was just curious, as young people can be. I was just curious, how do you do this? And so finding this reel-to-reel machine, it allowed me to experiment with some of those things. What I quickly realized was that you need more than one tape machine to actually make music. So I could make a tape loop on my Superba, but then what do I do with it? Today, tape machines and Nagras, even cassette players used for loops is a very fashionable, novel way of creating loops. It's been popularized by folks such as Heimbach. But they're all using them in tandem with the digital audio workstation. The digital audio workstation wasn't as ubiquitous in 1995 as it is today, and I certainly did not have one. So I realized that I could not simply make a tape loop and then have that be the finished piece of music, so I needed more. And that kind of led me to a sampler, and of course, not having a whole lot of cash, the sampler I chose was the Casio SK-1. The SK-1 was a big deal when it came out. I was a child, and you could see them all from my front yard, so I walked them all the time and just hung out. And I walked into a Sears one day, and they had the rack of Casios, and I walked up to the SK-1. I had no idea what sampling was. It says sampling on the front of it, but sampling wasn't a common word at the time. So I just pressed a key. There's speakers built in, so you could hear what it was going to do. Boom, pressed a key, and out came Aaron Masrum. Okay, that's strange. Press the higher key. Aaron Masrum. Lower key. Aaron Masrum. Okay, Aaron Masrum was the kid who lived up the street from me. Apparently, he knew how sampling worked because he had walked in and sampled his name into the SK-1 and left it there, which was just very astonishing to me. As a kid, I just didn't know how his name got in there. So, of course, I left the Sears and went and found Aaron and talked to him about it. And he explained to me, vaguely how this thing worked. And I went back and I played with it myself. It was very fascinating. I didn't get one, obviously, but if you fast forward to 1995, Casio SK-1s could be had for $10 at a thrift store or something. I found one, and that became the way that I was making the loops. And the tape machine became a way of recording them. The sound on sound was of great use. I could create a loop, record it to one channel, play that back, add something else, guitar, a vocal, another loop. Even the keyboard, the sound, the synthesizer built into the Casio SK-1. A drum machine. At that point, I had gotten a rudimentary drum machine, a Roland R5. So that became a way of making music, sound on sound, this idea of layering things. You're mixing as you go. The first thing you put down is going to be somewhat abstracted by the last things that you put down. You have to almost plan ahead. What do you want to be loudest and most punchy? Okay, you want to do that last, which means if you want your drums to be most punchy, you might have to record a temporary click track or something, play along to that for all your different passes, and then at the very end, drop that drum machine in. It's probably going to be skipping ahead and behind in phase as it plays back because nothing's synchronized. So yeah, that's the Superba. It also had that great echo switch on the front. But mostly it was just the ability to slow the tape down, change the speed, and do the sound on sound. I had kind of, like I said, I'd given up on the tape loops because they were fun, they were interesting, but like I said, I needed the Superba for capturing the music. But still, I do think there was something to be had in the tactile nature of creating a tape loop. It's a process, and it's decisions that you're making. They're very permanent, but they can also be very beautiful. So that kind of progressed for a while, but eventually I wanted to explore, looping, sampling, capturing sound, and manipulating it further. And I realized that I needed a sampler. I had a friend, Mike Lindsay, who played in a band in Chicago called Number One Cup, and they had gotten a budget to buy instruments from their label, and he had gotten an Akai MPC, which just seemed like an incredible thing. Of course, it was also very expensive at the time. This is probably like 96, 97, maybe actually probably more like 97, 98. Of course, I could not get an Akai MPC, but I could get an Ensoniq Mirage. And the Ensoniq Mirage was light years beyond the Casio SK-1 and potentially some sort of evil parallel timeline to the Superba reel-to-reel. Everything about using the Ensoniq Mirage was awful. It had the potential to do so many things that I wanted to do, but doing those things was quite hard. You see, the Ensoniq Mirage was programmed entirely in hexadecimal, which is not something that most humans are taught in school, and I certainly wasn't. And so it required learning this hexadecimal language in order to do things as simple as shortening a sample or changing the start time for a sample. Add to that some of the things that were so simple to do on the reel-to-reel machine, such as slow the tape down, was a process that took minutes. Type in this code into the special. They had two different operating systems. One was for playing back your samples. The other was for editing the samples. It was called MASOS, M-A-S-O-S. And there was a code for every single thing that it could do. So if you wanted to reverse it, or if you wanted to slow it down, there was a code you had to remember. You typed that in, and then you had to set the amount to which you wanted to perform this operation, again using hexadecimal. You type that in, hit enter, wait, and see where you landed. And it was a lot of trial and error, and when you got a good sample, when you got something to do close to what you wanted, it felt like a real victory. At one point, while living in Chicago, I had lost my job, and for a couple of months, actually for a whole summer, for about 3 months, I lived off of the proceeds from selling an Ensoniq Mirage sample set. I had made a bunch of samples for the Mirage, and then also I had traded a bunch of samples with other Mirage users and kind of compiled them into this really simple, useful disc set, and I was selling it for 20 bucks a pop. And I sold quite a few of them, actually. I think I sold like 40 or 50 of them, and it helped me get through a period of time where I didn't have a job. So thank you to the Ensoniq Mirage for that.
Have you got those samples?
I don't think I have them anywhere.
You got to sell a sample bank to Tony Rolando.
I would love to.
I sell hotcakes now.
I think that it probably disappeared with like a bad hard drive or something. The thing about the Mirage, it was a MIDI instrument. And like I said, where on the reel-to-reel, if I wanted to slow it down, there was just this vari-speed control that you would turn and the tape speed would slow down. If I wanted to play something in reverse, you could just flip the tape. If you wanted to layer something, I just hit that sound on sound switch and I could layer. It was very tactile and very fast. Whereas with the Ensoniq Mirage, there was always this, wall. You never felt like you could truly connect with it and have a relationship with it. At least I couldn't connect with it on the level that I was seeking. Now, a little later after that, I found the Akai S612. And as you can see, the Akai S612 has some knobs, some sliders, buttons that have dedicated functionalities. The 612 seemed quite a bit more useful to me than the Ensoniq Mirage, especially the sliders for the start and end time. These made editing, or just finessing your recorded material, really fast and intuitive. It was kind of an incredible step up from what I could do with the Mirage. The other knobs were pretty useless. It's for the filter, which was fine. It was not something that really drew me to the instrument. It was those sliders to control the start and end time. And I didn't know what granular synthesis was at this time. I hadn't read about it yet, but I think it was definitely headed in that direction, because you could do things like put the sliders pretty close together and chop up the sound in a way that just was not possible on the Ensoniq Mirage. And you got to keep in mind, this is like 96, 97. This is still like mid to late 90s. So the DAW thing hadn't really taken off yet. And there were people, and I knew people who had gotten into them. My roommate, Ryan Gallagher, was begging me to buy a computer to make music. He saw me struggling with things like the Mirage and the Akai. And he said, you need to get a computer. And there was another fellow in Chicago at that time that was big into computer music, and he was showing me, it might have been Maxim SP, I'm not positive, I feel like it was. He was showing me how he did stuff with the computer, but it all seemed so, it just seemed even further away than the Mirage or the Akai. It seemed so hard to figure out for me. It just seems so abstract, I guess is what I'll say. It seems so abstract. I just couldn't really wrap my head around it. So I kept going with the MIDI samplers. But the thing is, the MIDI samplers presented that problem. They were tied to a MIDI keyboard. If you wanted to change the pitch, you had to do it in steps on a MIDI keyboard. There was the Wall of MIDI. The Wall of MIDI is what prevents you from just taking an oscillator and sweeping the pitch. I felt the same way about a lot of MIDI keyboards. You couldn't just make something happen. They were set up to be played like a piano or an organ, which is fine because that's what most of the world wanted to do. And I wanted to be able to just play them by hand, manually. I just wanted to be able to sweep the speed of a sample that I had captured. It seems so simple today, but it was so hard at that time. Now, if I had been a little smarter about MIDI, if I had learned a little bit more about it, I probably could have figured out a way to assign a MIDI CC to the mod wheel of my keyboard. So for those of you that are pounding on the desk saying, you could have done it this way, I get that now. At the time, I didn't know that, and I didn't have anybody around me that could show me that. All I knew was that I could change the pitch with the black and white keys on the keyboard, and it didn't seem like there was any other way to do it. And so I was frustrated. The Wall of MIDI had kind of put a stop. Like, I didn't really feel like I could take it much further. So that was all kind of abandoned, and I got really into playing guitar and being in bands and that sort of thing, and didn't really think about any of this stuff, tape music, electronic music, synthesizers, any of that. For years, really. The bands that I was in played synthesizers. We had keyboards, but it was more in the realm of Duran Duran or something than Morton Subotnick. if that makes sense. It was pop, it was rock. We were just trying to make music that people could dance or bob their heads to. Eventually, eventually the bands broke up, and I found myself wanting to make music alone again. And I've always been drawn to electronic music. And at this time, drum and bass had happened, and I was very aware of it. I loved drum and bass. We'd go to this night called the Deadly Dragon Sound System. It was at the Empty Bottle every Sunday night. We'd go there and just party and dance. It was, I can't remember the name of the DJ. He was very good. There was guest DJs too, but there was one person who kind of led the Deadly Dragon Sound System. It was all records that were hard to get. Like records, I think most of this music was coming from the UK. It wasn't something where you could just find it easily. So this guy who DJ'd that night, I think he really spent a lot of time digging for that music. And those nights were super fun and kind of got me back into wanting to make electronic music again. And I had a computer. I think by this time, maybe people just had computers. I don't know. By the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, there were some companies making affordable audio interfaces. And I had gotten one of those. Oddly, I think the first audio interface I got was from Tom Oberheim's. Tom Oberheim briefly had an audio interface company. I didn't know this when I bought it. It was called C Sound or something like that. It was blue. It was pretty nice, but they were on discount. I believe that might have been the first audio interface I ever got, but I'm not positive. So I had a computer and I started trying some software for doing sampling. And this is where I first saw the term granular. Reaktor was pretty fresh at this time. And I had a neighbor who lived across the street, Tim Hurley, who played in the rock band Red Red Meat, and then later Caliphone, and then finally his own group, Synropus. And he was really into using computers for music. He was also really into playing guitar and so on, but he had this strange combination of the acoustic and electromechanical with the fully digital. He's probably the person that sold me on using computers for music. He had integrated them so well into what he was doing. It just seemed very impressive to me. But he was the person that had shown me Cubase and Reaktor. And Reaktor was the first time that I saw the word granular. There was these Reaktor ensembles that had the word granular in them, and they did things with audio samples. You could capture audio and put them into these ensembles, and they did things that I had never heard before. They went so far beyond the tape music that I was trying to explore from those records that I found at the library yard sale. It was not something I'd ever heard before. So I got Reaktor, and I started trying to use Reaktor. And there was something about using Reaktor for me that I always struggled with. I always felt like I couldn't quite connect with it. Again, it was sort of, in the past, it was that wall of MIDI, that feeling that the people who made the samplers, Akai, Ensoniq, really wanted you to play them with an organ-style keyboard. And with Reaktor, it felt like they really wanted you to control it with an ASCII keyboard or a mouse. I never felt that connection with Reaktor that I wanted to feel. And this could come from being a person who, I played drums, I played guitar, I played Farfisa combo organ, Roland Juno, anything I could get my hands on. I played any instrument that you would put in front of me. I'm not saying I played it well, but I liked to play it. I love playing drums. The Reaktor ensembles were more cerebral, I guess. You had to have some plan for what you were trying to do, and then you could build a device that did this. The sense of potential that I felt when trying to use it was incredible. It just seemed like anything was possible. The reality was that Reaktor was always a few steps ahead of my computer. That combined with just the screen and trying to navigate these really what seemed to me very complex processes using only a mouse and a keyboard. It just felt like another kind of wall. It felt like a literal brick wall just right in front of me, standing between me and what I wanted to do with the sound that I had captured. Sometimes I'm very basic. Sometimes I just want to slow something down or reverse it or make it go shorter or longer or louder or softer. Very basic. These seem like such basic things. If you're playing guitar and you want it to go faster, you just strum or pick faster. If you want it to go louder, you strum or pick harder. Softer, you lighten up your touch. It's so simple. If you want to change the pitch, you can choose. You can make a hard stop or you can slide to a different pitch. All of these things happen naturally as you're playing the instrument, assuming you've spent the time to learn how to play it and practice to develop your technique. None of these things, you're never going to be presented with any sort of block, no roadblocks in getting from this pitch to that pitch, that volume to that volume. But with Reaktor, I felt that there was great potential, but I could not achieve my goals with it. So I was met with that brick wall. And this is true of other softwares of the time. I tried some other ones. Reaktor, in my opinion, was definitely the best one. Granular was I believe I was running that on PC. You could record a sound into your sound card and load it in there, and there was a bunch of parameters, as you can see. You kind of hit go, and it would kind of do what it was going to do based on your parameter entry, and you could capture that, or it would like output it to a file that you could use elsewhere. There was others. There's this cloud generator, and I bring this up because I think it's interesting how the word cloud has permeated Granular. When people think of granular synthesis, cloud is always a word they think of. And here's another cloud software. And then finally you have Reaktor. And as you can see, I did a search for, this is a modern search, but even back at this time, when you searched Granular and Reaktor, there would be hundreds of results. And this was another thing that was a little bit overwhelming, you know, which granular ensemble should I try? I tried many of them. It was kind of incredible that people were coding these things or building them and sharing them. I think it did a lot for introducing Granular into the electronic musicians' vernacular. I would personally credit Reaktor for that, in my opinion. I'm sure that there's people who would argue with me on that, but they really, really allowed for it to be something that just basic musicians such as myself could come into contact with. And then here's emission control, which is the work of Curtis Rhodes. I never used emission control back in the day, but this might be a good time to talk about meeting Josh K. and Richard Devine. Josh and Rich were both obsessed with granular synthesis. Of course, they knew Curtis personally, or at least had met him. They definitely knew of his work. And I met Josh and Rich kind of accidentally. I had placed a Craigslist ad trying to trade some synthesizer modules, and Josh responded to the ad, not because he was interested in the modules, but because he wanted to meet me. He said, "Oh, you live in Asheville and you're into modular synths? I need to meet you." And so of course I said, "Yeah, sure." And we met. And at one point when we were hanging out, further on down the line, he brought Richard with him over to my house. And this is when I met Rich. Rich was just getting into modular too at this time. I think this was probably like 2006 or so. And they are telling me I need to learn more about granular. And they're telling me I need to read this book right here. This is Curtis Rhodes' Microsound. And it took me a while to get around to getting a copy, but I did get a copy of it. The first time I read it, I just kind of read through it as I could. I wasn't really reading it with some sort of purpose. I didn't take notes. I just tried to understand it and absorb it. And so that led to the development of the Phonogene.
Oh, it's over. That's actually only half the story. Stay tuned because Tony will be back to bring us up to the present with the story of the development of Phonogene and Morphagene. Thanks for watching.
I'd like to make communication with you. I'd like to make communication with you. I'd like to make communication with you. I'd like to make